17th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. As usual, I am assuming that everyone agrees unless a member indicates otherwise. Does any member object to taking item 3 in private? Members have agreed to take item 3 in private. Agenda item 2 is the National Fraud Initiative 2018-19. Can I welcome to the meeting our witnesses from Audit Scotland, Fiona Cordiak, Director of Audit Services, Angela Canning, Audit Director, Audit Services, and Anne Cairns, Manager, Performance Audit and Best Values. And can I invite Fiona Cordiak to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. Audit Scotland's report on the National Fraud Initiative 2018-19 was published on the 9th of July. The NFI is a counter-fraud exercise across the UK public sector which uses data matching to help prevent and detect fraud. It looks for fraud and error related to things like blue badges, public sector pensions and council tax discounts. The NFI exercise takes place every 2 years. 124 Scottish public sector bodies participated in the exercise during 2018-19. This is an increase in 11 since the 2016-17 NFI exercise. I'll briefly highlight some of the key messages from the report. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought significant risks and challenges across the public sector, including additional fraud risks that will be important for public bodies to identify and manage. Many staff are working remotely under extreme pressure, which makes good governance and sound controls more important than ever. We have highlighted some of these emerging fraud risks in our NFI report. We have also published a briefing paper on the 23rd of July, which provides more detail on emerging fraud risks from COVID-19 and, crucially, what public bodies can do to reduce these risks. Since we last reported on the NFI in July 2018, outcomes valued at 15.3 million have been recorded. This is a fall of 2.4 million since our last report. This fall could be due to less fraud and error in the system. It could be due to stronger internal controls preventing fraud and error happening in the first place, or it could be down to less effective detection of fraud and error. Most organisations demonstrate a strong commitment to counter fraud and the NFI. However, some could act more promptly and could ensure that sufficient staff are in place to investigate data matches. Local auditors have identified specific areas where some public bodies need to improve, and audit teams will follow up on these in the next exercise. Audit Scotland continues to work with the Cabinet Office and the Scottish Government in developing new ways to prevent and detect fraud and enhancing participation in the NFI across Scotland. Convener, as always, myself and my colleagues are happy to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona Cordiak. I'm now going to ask Colin Beattie to open up questioning on behalf of the committee.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to start by noting what Fiona said about there's 11 more organisations who have participated this year. This effort is voluntary, it's not enforceable. How many bodies do we have that in fact do not participate and at the moment are not invited to participate? And I'm thinking of things like ALIOs and so on. This is something we've discussed previously with the previous Auditor General, and we've kind of expressed some concern from this committee. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, Mr. Beattie. Audit Scotland can mandate bodies to participate in the National Fraud Initiative, but we can only mandate bodies that are subject to the Auditor General or the Accounts Commission audit regime. So obviously that doesn't include ALIOs, but bodies like ALIOs and public sector bodies out with the Auditor General and Accounts Commission remit can volunteer to take part. When we're thinking about the bodies that we mandate, we take a view on how significant the NFI is likely to be for them, because there is a cost to them for taking part in the NFI. So for very small bodies or bodies depending on the type of activity they undertake, sometimes we take a view that it's not worth them participating. If the committee are interested in the public sector bodies that do participate in the NFI, there's a full list on our website.
How many actually volunteer?
I don't have that information to hand. I'll maybe pass you on to Anne to see if she knows, but if not, that's something we can quickly get back to you on. Anne, do you have any more further information?
Thank you, Fiona. I don't have the information to hand. I do know the last exercise we had some housing associations volunteered some of their data, and we have some joint boards, but we will be able to come back to you with that information.
My concern obviously is whether there's a large gap in the information gathering here. There certainly was in previous occasions when we discussed it. I'd like to understand the extent to which that's continuing. But I'd like to just turn to fraud, which is always a popular one with this committee. You've flagged up that there is an increase in cybercrime, phishing emails and various scams trying to access public sector systems. And we've read in the newspapers about all this ransomware and so forth. How much evidence do you have of this? And how widespread is it actually?
I think one thing that I'd like to stress up front is that the likely fraud risks that we've outlined due to COVID-19 in our NFI report and in our more detailed briefing is based on our professional judgment from auditing the public sector and from helpful discussions we've had with colleagues in Police Scotland, NHS Scotland Counter Fraud Services and the Local Government Chief Internal Auditor Group.
But we're not talking about COVID-19 here.
Yeah, more generally, the briefing and the risks we outlined related to COVID-19 are not based on detailed audit work. So we don't yet have a clear picture on the spread or prevalence of these risks in practice. What we have got is we've got some anecdotal evidence to date that suggests those risks are real. So, for example, I can talk about Audit Scotland's own experience, and we have certainly seen an increase in email phishing risks since the start of the pandemic.
Over the years when the NFI has been coming to this committee, the question of fraud and cybercrime and so on has repeatedly come forward. And I'm interested to know, leaving the COVID-19 aside, because that's a rather particular area, which maybe I'll explore in a moment, but do you think that public sector bodies are taking adequate or appropriate action to minimise the risk of the day-to-day issues around phishing and the various scams that take place? And I've also been reading, actually, about one or two councils that have been subject to ransomware. And I'm not sure, down south of the border, but I'm not sure the extent to which anybody can be prepared for that. I'd be interested to hear your comment.
So the NFI report that we're talking about today doesn't specifically cover areas such as cybercrime or phishing attacks. Excuse me. We know from our work more generally that there is an increased prevalence of phishing attacks and cybercrime for public sector bodies and bodies more generally. We have done some audit work in some bodies to look at how general levels of preparedness. I think that has improved in recent years with much more publicity and visibility at some of these threats. But these threats are quite quickly moving and developing, and I think for any organisation it's hard to keep up to date with the latest threat level. But we haven't done any detailed work on this area, and we certainly haven't done any detailed work on it as part of our NFI work.
Okay, I mention it because it was something you did flag up as having an increase. Looking at the COVID-19, which you've already touched on slightly, clearly this is a whole new ballgame, and we're in early stages in this. Again, I've noticed newspaper reports from south of the border indicating potentially quite substantial proportions of funds that may have gone adrift, shall we say, to the wrong people, under the wrong criteria, whatever. And I saw one figure of 600 million for one particular tranche of money. Now, clearly, it's going to take time for all this to work through. Is there going to be, firstly, a specific effort coming from yourselves to identify where these misapplications have taken place? Are public bodies realistically able to take any more effort, any more measures than they are now against this type of fraud? Or is it unrealistic to expect that? And do you have any examples of where councils, particularly because they've been obviously the main conduit, have good practice in this regard?
I'll maybe pass you on a little bit later to Anne, who might be able to provide some information on what she's hearing from councils and what they're doing currently. I think in terms of what Audit Scotland is doing, we're trying to be proactive in this area. So part of the reason why we published our COVID-19 Emerging Fraud Risks briefing paper was to try and increase awareness in public sector bodies of the type of frauds that are possible, and also to give some suggestions of some remedial action that bodies can take to address those issues. You're right that we haven't undertaken any detailed audit work yet, Mr. Beattie, and that will take a bit of time. Audit teams at the moment, as you probably know, and I think as the Auditor General has flagged, are currently fully engaged in auditing the 2019-20 financial statements, and the timetable for that work is delayed from the normal timetable. However, towards the end of this year, we will start to think about planning our activity for the 2021 year, and fraud is going to be a particular issue in our consideration, and we will be thinking about how we want to best target our efforts. In terms of the NFI as well, we are in discussions with the Cabinet Office, and they already have some proposals to introduce some specific data matching related to COVID-19 support measures. So they are already on the case on that. So far, we think councils have been quite active. You mentioned councils in terms of fraud risks, and I'll just hand over to Anne, who might be able to talk a little bit more about what she's hearing that councils are doing, particularly in relation to some of the business grant support that they are administering.
Thanks, Fiona. With respect to the NFI in particular, there's a small pilot has been underway down south in a couple, I think about half a dozen English councils, and it's been run by the Cabinet Office to try to identify the best way to data match and use all available facilities in order to identify fraud, specifically in sort of applications for funding related to COVID-19. That will be getting rolled out across Scotland, hopefully the end of this month or into October, specifically looking at the sort of grants and things that were paid out to businesses. And the Cabinet Office are just finalising the outcomes of that pilot and just trying to identify exactly where the best matches, matching what with what data sets with what gives you the best outcomes. Not that's obviously in the future. Obviously, these grants and funding has been getting paid out since basically the beginning of April, and quite early on we were working with the Cabinet Office, and we were able to obtain access to some of their systems, because they obviously pay out multi-million-pound of grants every year, and they have systems in place that allows them to check sort of bank account verification details and actually check that a company is actually actively trading. So that has been available to our councils since the sort of spring this year. So when they are paying out grants or funding, they are able to tap into that service and verify if they've got any suspicions of a particular claim, or indeed put several claims through. As well as that, the councils have actually been quite really active between themselves. They've been sharing cases where they have maybe came across an application for funding and it's not, they've identified it's not right, the application has been fraudulent, the details have maybe been incorrect, and they're actually sharing that across the Scottish councils, believe it or not, on a daily basis. So that if an attack or someone attempts to get funding from one council, you know, the other councils are made aware of the details of that, because what they're finding is it could be national companies that these fraudsters are attacking. They're presenting themselves as being a representative of a national company, and obviously these national companies have offices, shops, whatever it might be across the country. So the councils have been pretty proactive. It's not perfect. I mean, it was set up, you know, very, very quickly, but that has been going on and is still going on just now. I hope that gives you a kind of flavour of what's going on.
Just one last point. Looking at Audit Scotland specifically here, you build your audit programmes according to your desired outcomes and so forth. Looking at COVID-19, the speed with which funding has had to be produced, the relatively low level of scrutiny and perhaps lesser due diligence than would normally be there, obviously creates new challenges for Audit Scotland in terms of how it approaches its audit and how it requests its auditors in the field to approach that audit. Are you alert to that? Are you prepared for that?
Mr. Beattie, we're very alert to that risk. All our audit work is risk-based, so we well identify the risks that have been brought about by new payment streams being brought in at speed. As you say, bodies are having to balance the need to get money out to those that need it most at speed and pace, with the need to get internal controls in place. We also flag in the NFI report and in the briefing some of the additional risks that come about from staff working in unfamiliar areas, capacity issues, etc. All brings risk. So yes, our audit teams are very aware to those risks, and it's something that we will be looking at as part of the 2021 audits. I'm also in discussions with the other audit agencies across the UK facing exactly the same issues, and we are interested in exchanging experiences and good practice and thinking about how we address some of those risks in the year to come. So I can give you the assurance, Mr. Beattie, we are very aware and very alert to those risks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beattie. I have a supplementary request from Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It goes right back to Colin Beattie's first question, and that is the number of bodies that take part in the National Fraud Initiative. But really, I'm interested in the number of bodies that don't take part. Do you have a figure of the bodies that have said they won't take part?
So I don't have that figure to hand. I think for the bodies that are mandated by Audit Scotland, they don't have any choice. They have to take part. So if we choose to mandate a body, it has to take part. And if we don't think that it is participating sufficiently well, we highlight those bodies in the NFI report that you've got in front of you today, and also the local auditors will highlight any deficiencies. So anyone that we ask has to take part. Other bodies can volunteer, I don't have to hand a number for you about how many bodies within the public sector audit remit haven't been mandated to take part.
Yeah, so I get that. Yeah, I get that some have to take part, but some don't have to take part. So that's the bit I'm interested in. If you could maybe come back to us with a number, that would be useful. Even a list, as long as it's not too long. I think that would certainly be of interest. Thanks, convener.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. Can I just pick up on that then with you, Fiona Cordia? What's the process of mandating a body? So is that just a decision that Audit Scotland can take, or does that require regulation? How does that work in terms of how an organisation is mandated?
Yes, it is a decision that Audit Scotland takes. I'll maybe pass you on to Anne, who can talk you a little bit through the process of how we go about that. Anne, can you help out, please?
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, under the legislation, the Criminal Justice and Licensing Act, Audit Scotland can mandate any body that is under our audit remit. And internally, we would review the bodies, because obviously we know what size they are, what sort of systems they have, what sort of services they provide. And we would make a call in conjunction with the local auditors, who are aware of the sort of local risks as well, as to which ones would get most benefit out of the NFI. The ones who aren't currently mandated tend to be very small numbers of employees, and it tends to be sort of the smaller central government bodies. All councils are mandated, all health boards, apart from I think the Mental Health Commission, because of the size. But that's really the way we go about it.
Are you confident that everyone that should be mandated is mandated?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Just turning back to Mr. Beattie's question around the COVID-19 money, I realise obviously this is quite fresh and ongoing, and I'm not for a second questioning all the programmes that have gone in to try and support individuals and businesses. But I did have a few specific questions. One, will all those grants that are going to Scotland, not necessarily administered in Scotland, but going to Scotland, be covered by the National Fraud Initiative, or will some be for other people's responsibility?
So
I'll give you an example. So an example would be the bounce back loans. Would that come under the National Fraud Initiative, or would that be somebody else's remit?
So the National Fraud Initiative itself covers the whole of the UK. So whether it comes within Audit Scotland's part of the NFI, or the English part of the NFI, or the Welsh part of the NFI, it should still be covered if it's viewed as significant, and if it lends itself to data matching. So if it lends itself to producing data sets that can be matched against other data sets. And may be able to give a little bit more information on what the Cabinet Office are considering at the moment in relation to new COVID-19 data sets.
Thanks, Fiona. And specifically in relation to the NFI, the data sets that will be matched this autumn are related to the business grants that are paid out to businesses. That doesn't cover all the funding that has come out from the Scottish Government. There is a newly self-employed fund. I believe it's £2,000 people can claim for, and that is actually an improvement service, and the councils are looking to do some data matching around that themselves. The grants we're looking at tend to be the sort of larger ones, the 25,000, 10,000 sort of grants. The Cabinet Office, obviously, as Fiona says, deal with across the UK, and particularly with just the NFI. That's all that's included in that, although I am aware there have been discussions ongoing over the last few months in Cabinet Office looking at some of the other national schemes and how they may tackle that. but that's out with the actual NFI, and I don't have the particular details to hand today about that.
And given the level of money that has been dispersed and the number of schemes that have been introduced, has the capacity increased at the National Fraud Initiative to reflect that added risk and that added workload? Do you want to, Cordia?
I don't have that information at hand at the moment. I know that the Cabinet Office have been reviewing and consulting on changes to the NFI regime and how it's funded and resourced, but I'm not aware of the outcome of that review. I don't know if, Anne, if you've got any further information.
Thanks, Fiona. With respect to the NFI team in the Cabinet Office, they have reprioritised their work over the last 6 months, basically since the lockdown started. So they have totally reprioritised their work to look at COVID-19. Within the Cabinet Office, there's a separate team from the team that deals specifically with the NFI. There's a wider team called the Fraud, Error and Debt team. And historically, that has always done, as you say, fraud, error and debt, specifically within large grants that the Cabinet Office and the UK Government pay out. And that team, I believe, has also been refocusing their attention over the last 6 months, specifically towards the COVID-19 funding that has been going out. So I don't think they'll get, not that I'm aware they've got any extra staff as such, but they've put everything, they've reprioritised their workload to basically focus on the COVID-19 work.
And is that just in the Cabinet Office? Because obviously there are money that was devolved down to the Scots Government and then money that was sent down to councils for councils to administer funds. Have they increased their capacity in terms of fraud investigation?
Convener, I don't think we have any information on that at the moment. I'm not aware at the moment of any councils increasing their fraud teams at the moment, but that is something that we will consider as part of the 2021 audit when we are looking at the measures that bodies have put in place to address the various fraud risks. As always, there will be a balance to be achieved between prevention and detection.
Would you expect them to?
So that's a hard one to answer. I think what we're saying in our COVID-19 emerging fraud risks briefing is we're encouraging bodies to make a risk assessment and to look at bringing in new internal controls and new detection measures towards the areas of greatest risk. So it's hard for me to, at this moment, to make a general sort of pronouncement or give you a general view on what bodies should be doing. And again, all bodies have capacity constraints, etc. And the public sector in Scotland has been under massive pressure to respond to the pandemic, and a lot of the immediate efforts have been directed naturally towards response. Efforts will also have to be directed towards the building back better and what the new normal will be looking like. So anybody has to balance their efforts between delivery to support the citizens and the public sector, etc., and protecting the public purse. All public bodies have a duty to protect the public purse. So we will be expecting appropriate arrangements to prevent and detect fraud being in place. But as to whether that would mean an increase in fraud detection activity, or, as Anne highlighted for the Cabinet Office, a reprioritisation of some of that activity, I couldn't really say at the moment. Thank you.
But surely the fraud detection should be. I'm not claiming that it needs to happen immediately, or that it needs to happen, or needed to happen through the height of the pandemic, because understandably, staff's priority needs to be going to as much as possible on the frontline effort to suppress the virus and defeat the virus. I'm meaning more as hopefully we continue to get out of the pandemic, and we get into a management and I hope elimination phase of the virus, we then have a bit more room, a bit more space, and again that reprioritisation effort begins to try and build back better. But part of building back better and protecting the public purse is making sure that we limited as much as possible, or we hold to account as much as possible, those who took advantage of the fact that we were in crisis to defraud the system. So surely as part of that Build Back Better process, we do need to have strong measures in place to retrospectively look at what might have happened during the pandemic and to try and get some of that money back, maximise it. As you say, the public finances will be tight, so surely we want to get that money back away from people that may have defrauded the system and back to delivering proper public services for the communities across Scotland.
You're right, Convener. We would expect retrospective checking to be undertaken in high-risk areas. But again, there's a balance to be struck between putting in place good protective measures that prevents fraud and error happening in the first place. So we'll be expecting bodies to do a risk assessment and basically prioritising their effort, where they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck, where they're going to get the most return for the public purse. And that will be getting a balance between.
But how do we measure that? But how do we measure that, Fiona Cordia? How do we measure that? Because I take what you're saying about we'll have a report next year, and yes, we need to demonstrate to people. Okay, we need to tell people and give them a guidance around adequate measures. Is there any process of making sure that when the measures are implemented, the measures are adequate, rather than looking a year later whether the measures were adequate, and therefore perhaps meaning that fraud has taken place when we could have avoided it?
So part of the normal annual audit activity at any public sector body includes reviewing arrangements for the prevention and detection of fraud and corruption. So that's a core bit of the annual audit activity out at various public sector bodies. So our audit teams will be looking at that in the coming year and will be reporting on the adequacy of those measures in their annual audit reports. And that will include the internal controls that are in place to prevent fraud and the investigation and detection activity. What we're also trying to say is that at this time good governance has never been more important, and there's a real role for audit and scrutiny committees and bodies to make sure that they are aware of the changing risk profile in their organisation and are satisfied with the steps that are taking place by management to respond to those risks. And in light of that, later, I think it was the 23rd of August, we published a good practice briefing for audit and risk committees, which highlights some of the questions that they should be asking their organisations now around about the response to COVID-19. And the questions that we are highlighting they should be asking about concerns internal control and assurance arrangements, financial reporting, governance, and risk management. So we've tried to be proactive and helpful.
Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Alec Neil.
Can I begin, Fiona, by asking you, for the latest year, how much did the National Fraud Initiative cost to run and implement in Scotland across the board?
Mr Neil, in our report we've tried to estimate the cost of the NFI. So I'm just having a look at the report just now. I think that is on page 17. So it's always quite difficult to estimate the cost of participating in the NFI with any degree of precision. What we do know is the cost that Audit Scotland pays to participate in the NFI. So that was £213,750, and we ask a number of bodies to estimate the cost of their participation in the NFI. So we've set out some of that in page 17 of our report. But for many bodies, they don't do their work on the NFI as a discrete exercise. It's part of their overall fraud prevention and investigation activity. So it's quite hard for them to specifically identify the cost of the NFI, but where they have, we have outlined that on page 17 of our report. What we're clear about, though, is that the cost of running the NFI and participating in the NFI is significantly less than the returns. And the returns in the current exercise were £15.3 million, a combination of overpayments already made and estimated future savings from losses that would have happened if the fraud or error hadn't been corrected. So we do think, although it's difficult to estimate the total cost, it is significantly less than the benefits of the NFI.
What's your ballpark? Is it 7 million, 5 million, 10 million? What's your ballpark figure for the total cost?
We've tried to estimate that as best we can on page 17 of the report. We think that for an individual body, the costs vary, as we've highlighted, from £120 to £30,000. So it does vary. And as I said, the cost for Audit Scotland is £213,000.
Yeah, but I mean, the NFI, you're claiming that over the period, you've in the latest figures, I think it's £15 million. So that 15.3 million, to judge the value for money for that, really, you've not just got to know the outcome, you've got to know how much it costs to achieve that figure. Yes. So you don't have a total against the 15.3 million.
So I think, as I said, we know the cost to us, but what we haven't done is...
specifically, do you have a global cost for Scotland? Do you have a global cost for Scotland? Right. So you can't really tell. So you can't really tell the global value for money. The second point is, if you look at the figures in your own report, you say that when it started in 2006-07, since then in Scotland you've recovered basically just under £144 million, which is just over an average of £13 million a year. And as you also point out, in the last 2 years, that has actually gone down to an average of £7.5 million a year, almost cut in half. Now, you've covered the point in your report and in your remarks already about the possible reasons for that reduction. But even taking the £13 million a year on average, the public sector in Scotland spends something of the order, if you add in local government, well over £40 billion a year. So £13 million as a percentage of well over 40 billion, and this year it'll probably be well over 50 billion, doesn't seem a very high amount. And it's a decreasing amount, because if you take the figure going back to nearer when it started, the total public spending in Scotland was nearer 30 billion. It's risen to well over 40 billion, and possibly this year over 50 billion. And yet the amount of fraud is going in the other direction. But as a totality, do you really think we're scraping the surface of fraud and overpayments and the like in Scotland? Seems a very, very small figure as a percentage.
So I think that it's probably worth remembering that most public sector expenditure is paid correctly and is paid to the correct people and the correct recipients. So fraud and error is only a small part of the system. We think that there is a lot of value from the NFI that can't be measured. So it's not part of the 15.3 million. There's obviously the deterrent impact of the exercise itself. So employees will be notified on their payslips, for example, that their data will be subject to data matching. All of the Audit Scotland staff were just notified of that this week by coincidence. Service recipients will be notified as well that their data will be used for data matching. So that helps to have a deterrent impact to fraud. We also think that when organisations investigate the data matches and they come across fraud and error, it gives them the opportunity to have a look at why that fraud and error occurred, and to go back and to review their systems and to tighten up on any weaknesses that occurred. So I think in our view, 15.3 million of outcomes is only part of the story. There's the deterrent impact that just can't be measured, and there's also the opportunity that investigating the matches gives to tighten up on systems.
But if you added all the additional costs in public sector bodies of the internal audit function and the external audit function and the NFI on top of that, and this is the best they can do.
I think
you added up the total cost of audit in Scotland in the public sector, it's coming to tens of millions of pounds. You know, the internal audit function, very often it's put out to fairly expensive multinational accountancy companies. The external function, also a lot of that's put out to big companies making a lot of money on it on a consultancy basis. And on top of that, the National Fraud Initiative. Is there not time we sort of looked at this in totality and said, is there not a better way and more effective way to do this? Because, you know, we've seen many examples where the internal audit function has failed. We've seen many examples where we think the external audit has been totally inadequate, despite the payments being paid to the external auditors. And now we see a National Fraud Initiative, and it's impossible to measure its value for money. Some of the reasons for that are perfectly justified. But do we not need a total look at this? Because, quite frankly, we're spending a lot of money, but I'm not sure we're getting much of a return from auditors and the NFI.
Mr. Neal, obviously in my position, I would argue that good governance and good assurance costs money. I think the public have a right to expect that public money is spent on the purposes intended and is directed to those that are entitled to that money and those services, and not to those that choose to defraud the public purse. I think, yes, money is spent on internal audit, external audit, NFI, but what you're seeing today in terms of the NFI report is only a small fraction of what those assurance mechanisms bring to the public sector. You're probably aware there's been a significant debate in the corporate audit sector, largely focused on the fact that too little audit is undertaken to meet the needs of employees and stakeholders, etc. So it's a live debate at the moment, and very live debate more generally across the UK about the level of assurance the public can expect and actually the money they're prepared to pay for that assurance. The audit process, the internal audit process, the external audit process, we could always do more. It would cost more. We could do less. It would provide less assurance. That's a public debate to be had, and obviously people like yourself, Mr. Neal, have a view.
Yeah, obviously, I'm referring to many of the Section 22 reports where the audit function has failed miserably in a number of cases, and that's miserably, even though executed by well-paid individuals, either in the public sector or externally. Another proxy for looking at how effective it is, if you take, for example, the 15.3 million of outcome from the NFI over the last 2 years, how much of that was fraud as opposed to overspending or wrong spending, and how many criminal charges have resulted from the fraud element? And how many criminal convictions have resulted from the fraud element?
Maybe to take your first point, Mr. Neal, I would argue that Section 22 reports coming to the committee are evidence of the audit process working well, because that means that significant issues and significant...
You're saying the Tayside Health Board, the audit function worked well? You must be joking.
I think the external audit function did work well on NHST side, yes.
That's not the opinion. I don't think that was the opinion of the committee, but anyway, we'll leave that for another day. We've already dealt with that. I don't think we would share that enthusiasm or endorsement, quite frankly. But anyway, sorry, I was interrupting you.
Yeah, and so you were asking about the split between, in terms of the outcomes, what was fraud and what was error.
Yeah.
So of the 15.3 million of outcomes from this particular exercise on the NFI, 5.6 million of that was actual overpayment or error. 9.7 million was forward savings from losses that were avoided by the issue being picked up. Of the 5.6 million actual overpayments, 3.2 million of that was identified as fraud. So of the 15.3 million, 3.2 million was identified as fraud, which is 21%. However, what bodies do when they investigate the matches is they assign the overpayment to either fraud or error. And it's our understanding that if there's any doubt in that, the bodies will tend to classify the issue as error rather than fraud. So it's only if they've got pretty clear evidence that it is fraud and fraudulent intent that they will classify it as fraud. So we suspect that the fraud element is probably slightly underestimated. I'll come to Anne in a moment to see if she has any further information, but I don't think we know at the minute to what extent the issues classified as fraud have resulted in prosecution. I think we know some individual cases, but I don't think we know the overall picture. Anne, can you help us out on this?
Can I just interrupt here before Anne answers? You know, I think one of the points you made earlier, Fiona, was that one of the outputs, and it's an unquantifiable output from having a national fraud initiative, is the deterrence effect. If we don't know what happens to the people who allegedly commit the fraud, then we're missing out on, you know, a useful tool for deterrence, because clearly if a clear message is sent that if you defraud the public purse and found out, you will be taken to the cleaners. Surely that's a deterrence effect, a very effective deterrence effect, I would have thought.
Yes, I agree. Definitely it would be a deterrent effect. And I think there's at least one case we've highlighted in a report where someone was taken to court. But obviously there's a time lag on many of these cases, and often it is some time before we can actually report the ultimate result. I don't know, Anne, have you got any more information?
Thanks, Fiona. I don't, off the top of my head, know the exact number for the 18-19 exercise, because as you said, there is a time lag, but I would suspect it would be really small numbers, because it's mainly councils who have the most outcomes, and there is a cost benefit. First of all, the procurator fiscal, if it's a relatively small fraud, you know, and I'm talking maybe a few £1,000s, the procurator fiscal wouldn't take that case through. So we're hearing that from councils. So in which case the council just goes ahead and tries to recover the money. So it tends to be only the sort of larger value cases that they would put forward through the prosecution route. And again, it's for the individual bodies, as I say, mainly councils and NHS counter fraud services, to actually determine from their own internal review and what evidence they've got, whether that would be worthwhile spending additional funds to go through that. Having said that, they do report when they do get a prosecution and it's successful. For example, the NHS Counter Fraud Service are very active on Twitter, so if they've got any cases, even if it's got to be anonymous, they do like to share and promote it through that way.
Thank you. Thank you, convener. That's me finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hale. I'll hand over to Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. I'm going to follow up on what Alex Neil was asking about there, because it seems to me that, you know, if we want to deter people, we do need to know how many prosecutions from your work. And I think we need to know details of those prosecutions. We need to know if prosecutions haven't been taken forward, if the fiscal is a block on prosecutions. Let's hear about it. You know, so it seems to me that in your reports, you should be spelling out how many people have been prosecuted as a result of your work. Is that not possible to do?
It's not something that we've ever tried to do to date, Mr. Simpson. I think there would be resource implications about trying to gather that information. And as Anne said, there is a time lag between fraud and then any potential prosecution. Obviously, it's not for us to question the Procurator Fiscal's decision on what to take to court and what not to take to court. That isn't an area that Audit Scotland would have any remit on. And obviously, again, it's also for each individual organisation also to decide what they have the evidence to prosecute and what they don't. So there's a limit to Audit Scotland's remit in this in this area, and it's not something that we've ever tried to gather statistics on before.
Just on that, Fiona Cordia. Sorry, on you go, Graham Simpson. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it just seems to me you can't deter people unless we know that people are actually being prosecuted as a result of your work. I mean, that seems a very simple point. So somewhere that information has to be collated. I just ask you to take that away with you. Fiona, can I just come in on that,
Graham Simpson, before you move on, please? Yeah. Sure, these organisations that are part of the National Fraud Initiative will have an ongoing record of ongoing investigations, because they'll be asked to provide evidence in closed cases or cases that are then going to go on to the courts. So surely you would expect individual organisations to have that information, and the issue is then whether you have the mechanism to collate it nationally, or are we saying that even the individual organisations don't do that? Because that would really worry me if individual organisations weren't having a tracking mechanism and then it was just a matter of collecting data nationally.
No, Convener, organisations will have that data, and it's quite a rare thing. So it's not as if they're going to have, you know, lots of cases on the go at any point in time. So we could collate it. I'm not sure how we would be able to track through from a particular NFI exercise to the number of cases arising from that particular exercise, but we might be able to do that, because obviously I would suspect that there might be some cases even from the last NFI exercise in 2016-17 that might still be working their way through.
Of course, and that's why it would make sense. So if an organisation that's part of NFI detects a fraud, reports it to the police, it's being investigated, it will record that information somewhere. If that then leads to a prosecution, they will record that somewhere. So I understand the difficulty in reporting within a calendar or a financial year about what has been a successful prosecution within a financial year, because that's not going to happen, let's be honest about it. Someone could commit a fraud in 2016 and they might not be convicted for it until 2019, 2020 on some occasions. So no one is expecting you to say within one financial year what fraud was detected, what successful prosecution was made. But surely if we're going to keep a rolling system here in terms of what's happened in 2016 and how does that compare with 2020, we can say there are still X number of ongoing investigations, there was X number of successful prosecutions, there are X number of court proceedings coming up. And if those individual organisations are collecting that data, which they should be, then I don't think there's much of a big administrative issue for Audit Scotland to then, because you're asking them for other information already, is asking that as one additional question, and then collating that information doesn't seem like a very difficult or rather cumbersome thing to do?
I think, as Mr. Simpson suggested, leave that with us, and we'll come back to you, and we'll consider how feasible it is, and what the resource impact would be for us on that, and we'll come back to you if we think it's possible or not.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Simpson.
Thanks. That was very useful. Fiona, in your opening comment, you said that some organisations, and I'm quoting you, could act more promptly as a result of your recommendations. Could you tell us which organisations have been dragging their feet?
I'll pass you on to Anne in a moment for that detail. But probably worth stressing generally, in my experience and over the years of my involvement with NFI, bodies have got much better at engaging with NFI and responding to NFI. I think in our report we give you a comparison on engagement in the current exercise compared to the previous one. I think if we went back to previous exercises, you would see a picture of steady improvement. But Anne can give us you a bit more information about those small number of bodies, granted, that did less well as part of the current exercise. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Fiona. I think in the report we say that 3 colleges submitted their data quite late, and it was after several prompts, both from ourselves and from the local auditors. That was Perth, North Highland and South Lanarkshire College. I should like to point out, we've already mentioned that we increased the number of bodies participating in the last NFI, and the majority of the new participants were colleges. So of those 3 colleges, it was all new to them. It was all strange. It was, you know, it wasn't just a sort of counter fraud team. It was involving IT, trying to extract data in the relevant format. So they did sort of struggle in some cases with the IT resource, and they also cited general resources to actually undertake the NFI. Although we had given guidance and sort of feedback, and even the local auditors have a get experience of other audit clients that are participants in NFI, it was all pretty new to them, and they had other things as their priorities. So that was basically what happened the last time. In order to sort of look at that going forward, obviously the local auditors have identified improvement actions in each of the particular bodies, and that has been reported and followed up. We also have arranged 3 engagement sessions with the participants later on this month, and the colleges have been very proactive in joining them. So we're going to do it a bit like this. It's through Microsoft Teams, and we're going to be doing that so that, and we're splitting it into different sections, so a lot of the colleges will be together and can bounce issues off each other, and we hope that that will help them get a good start for the next exercise.
Okay, so hopefully that won't happen again if they're being helped. Can I just ask about, I think it was you, Fiona, mentioned audit and scrutiny bodies, probably in councils. Now, I used to be a councillor, and I used to sit on an audit body. I can assure you, and you've probably witnessed it yourself, that many councillors are not forensic when it comes to audit and scrutiny. So it's all very well issuing a good practice guide, but I just wonder whether you actually go along to any of these committees and witness what goes on, and whether you have any observations of how they're performing.
Over my years as an auditor, Mr. Simpson, I have attended various audit committees in local government, in central government, in the health sector, and the level of scrutiny varies between bodies, some much more effective than others. Our local audit teams will routinely be in the practice of attending pretty much every audit and scrutiny meeting, at the bodies that they audit, and part of their role and part of their job is to comment on and report on the effectiveness of scrutiny in each individual body, and they are also on hand to assist audit committees in their scrutiny activity. I know that a number of teams have participated in training events for audit and scrutiny committee members, so that is something that the audit community is quite active in. But yes, I've seen plenty audit and scrutiny committees over my 30 odd years as an auditor. I think over the piece, I think scrutiny has absolutely improved, but it's still patchy.
Yeah. Sometimes I think these bodies actually need to be directed, because if you don't know where to look or what to ask, then you can't ask it. You know, and a lot of councillors, they're not experts. You wouldn't expect them to be. So, yeah, maybe we need to rethink how these bodies operate. It's just a thought. I'm not really asking you to comment on that. If I can ask about, there's a couple of things in the report. First of all, on council tax reduction, that's page 14 of the report. And you say that councils have identified more than double the number of cases, that's in 2018-19, but each with a smaller value. And you say that suggests that fraud and error is being picked up more quickly. Have you got any evidence for that?
No, we don't have any specific evidence for that, because the NFI exercise doesn't lend itself to that kind of causational data, but that is just our suspicion from what we know is happening out at councils. And I wonder if, Anne, can you provide any more information on this?
Thanks, Fiona. Our thinking behind that comment in the report was, over the last couple of years, the councils have had more access and better access to DWP systems in particular, and this kind of links into the housing benefit outcomes as well. Although they've gone up, they're getting identified quickly. And for example, over the last couple of years, councils have, particularly in the housing benefit side, been able to get access directly from HMRC's real-time information. So if an employer sends in their payroll to HMRC and it then results in a significant difference between the previous month's pay for that employee, an alert would go to a council screen to say that that person was on benefit, and it looks like their income has either gone up or gone down, and it looks like the case may need to be reviewed. So, and it actually comes up every day on the council screens. Obviously, it's sorted by the risk settings and value of the change. So that has really been business as usual over the last couple of years, and through that, if it comes up for a housing benefit claim, the council's able to say, well, that person's now moved into a job or a better paid job. They get them in to review their housing benefit, and at the same time they review their council tax reduction. So I've got a suspicion that is maybe that's our relatively new system starting to filter through in the results and the outcomes.
That all makes sense, but I wonder if we could, if there's any way of confirming that that's the case. It's very good if these things have been picked up, and in the report you point out that not all of this is fraud. A lot of it's just error. I mean, it's people forgetting forgetting that they've got the reduction, or councils overlooking it. So clearly, if councils are linked up to HMRC and DWP, that is a good thing. But I think from our point of view, if we were to get a bit more evidence of that would be useful. Is that possible?
We'll see what we can do on that, Mr. Simpson. I think part of the issue with NFI has always been it is very difficult to extract the reasons for movements in outcomes. I think, as I said at the start, it's hard to tell if it just means that there's genuinely less or more fraud and error in the system, or whether internal controls are better up front, or perhaps bodies aren't investigating the matches that do come out as effectively as they might. It's quite difficult to get clear evidence at what's at play in any particular case or issue. What we do try to do in the report is bring out what we think might be the reasons, but it's quite hard to get tangible evidence. But again, we'll take that away and have a little think about, for the next exercise, what we could do to more clearly try and pin attribution.
Okay, that's very useful. I've just got one final question, Convener. Again, from the report, you mentioned that there was a pilot, and this is to do with the small business bonus scheme. So a pilot to help identify businesses inappropriately claiming through the scheme, and you identified 412,000, just over £412,000. If that was spread across, so 7 councils took part. If that was spread across Scotland, it would amount to 1.9 million. Now, obviously, so first of all, that pilot was obviously done a wee while ago. So there's been a gap. I presume the pilot's finished. So what's happened in the meantime? You say in the report that the Scottish Government is considering a national rollout. That's not happened yet. Why not? And you also say there are some system weaknesses that were identified. Can you say what they were?
I'll pass you over to Anne for much of this detail. That was the non-domestic rates pilot, I think you're talking about, yes?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Anne, can you give us a bit of detail what you know on that?
Yes, thanks, Fiona. Yes, you're quite right. This pilot was done sort of last autumn time, specifically looking at the small business bonus scheme. And we worked with the Scottish Government's non-domestic rates team in order to undertake the pilot, and they were very delighted with the outcomes that over the 7 councils they managed to identify that value of incorrect awards being identified, and were able to indeed correct that. The Scottish Government were very keen to take that forward. They were looking at whether to extend the same pilot over all 32 councils, or whether to do it in different sort of non-domestic rates relief and try that. Obviously, that was just as COVID-19 and lockdown, and the non-domestic rates team in Scottish Government have been inundated with trying to get the business support out to the businesses over the last 6 months. We have caught up with them just last month, but they are still not really, they do want to go ahead and roll it out, but it's not really made that much progress, but we will be progressing that over the next year with the Scottish Government's non-domestic rates team.
So they haven't said when they'll roll it out?
No.
What about the system weaknesses that you identified? Can you say what they were?
Yeah, the system weaknesses were actually in some of the individual councils. When the data matching was undertaken and they got the matches back, it was actually weaknesses in their data recording, how they had recorded things, and things were coming up as being matches. When actually we looked at it, it was due to an error in how they had recorded things on their systems. So that they have been corrected, and obviously that's been raised with that individual council and shared across the others. It seemed to be particular issues in particular councils just about recording data. We have actually got an evaluation of the pilot available on our website as well.
Okay, I'll have a look at that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I'll now go to Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. My questions have actually been covered by other members, so I'm happy to move on to another member if they wish to do so.
Thank you, Mr Bibby. I'll go to Mr Bowman.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I think a number of the issues have been raised by others, but if I can just run through them and see if there's a different angle. I'll go through them and then we can come back to the individuals just to give you a bit of a heads up. This is a different form of report, I think, from the normal one. Can you tell us how much time and resource it took to put together? And is the 213,000 cost you mentioned just staff costs? You said there was a list of the bodies who participated on your website. I found a link in the report that told me the type of bodies that participated. I couldn't actually see, I apologise if I missed it, a list of the named bodies. How are you ensuring the message gets out to the right people in governance? You know, they really get the message, they know they should be reading this. I think Alan Neil asked about the billions of spending in the public sector. So how much of those billions have actually been covered by this initiative? And do we have an estimate of the level of fraud, the pounds, in the public sector? So if we can...
A lot of questions. To be honest, I'll hand back to you.
Luckily, I've made a note of them as you were saying them, Mr Bowman. Yes, it's a different form of report from the last time you will have seen the report. We hope it is more accessible. We hope it is more attractive to the reader. And I think it's less wordy than our previous report, and there's more graphics. It's an in-house production, so it's Audit Scotland's own communications team that produced the report. Angela Ann and her colleagues are responsible for all the hard work that goes into it. No, the cost that you see at the end, about 213,750 Audit Scotland costs, that is our cost of participating in the NFI, so that money goes to the Cabinet Office. And will correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's not basically our cost of doing the audit work. The cost that local audit teams spend on NFI is part of the overall audit effort. So it is part of their review of...
Do you have a rough estimate of how many person days or weeks, or you could maybe tell us later? We might be able to tell you that information later. I can't say off the top of my head whether our in-house audit teams have a specific charging code for NFI or whether it goes to fraud and fraud activity more generally. I think it might be more difficult to gather the information for the audit firms. I'm not sure how they collect their costs. So we can get back to you on that about whether we have that or whether we don't have it. Okay.
I'll go over to Anne on the list of bodies question. In terms of how we get these messages to the right people in governance situations, obviously we have our Audit Scotland communication mechanisms and Twitter and Facebook and trying to get the messages out more generally. But each of our audit teams in audit bodies have a responsibility to promote the findings of the report in each of their individual bodies, and they are active in the NFI exercise on a routine basis. So if they have reported any issues with a particular body's engagement or non-engagement with the NFI, they will follow that up routinely as part of the annual audit process. So we like to make sure that our audit teams are making sure some of these messages get in front of the people that need to know, particularly audit and risk committees as well, so that it can help them in their scrutiny activity.
I'm taking Alec Neil's point about some of the bad governance we've seen, and Graham Simpson's about perhaps people not being familiar with the type of issues underlying it. Will you actually present this, or will it just be a report that's emailed around audit committees?
It varies. It will depend on a particular audit committee and how they go about their business. What I can say though, for the bodies that participate in the NFI, there will generally be a short summary of the body's participation, etc., in each auditor's annual audit report. So they will get their specific messages, their unique messages through the annual audit report, but we also hope that our auditors are bringing the overall report to the attention of their audit committees as well. But practice will vary depending on whether they have it as a formal item in their agenda for discussion or whether it's just circulated for noting. So that will vary from body to body. But we're very keen, if we're doing all this work, that it's having impact. And as I just said earlier, it's one of the reasons why we tried to change the format of the report to make it more accessible.
I think on the format, it's useful to have perhaps not too many words, but a little bit of a description of how you went about it would have helped me a little bit in just understanding the results.
That's very useful feedback, Mr. Bowman. So we can take that. We can take that back. We're always interested to get feedback on how well our reports are received, and anything that we can do to help them, and to make them better in the future. So that's very good feedback. In terms of the list of bodies, Anne, do we have the individual bodies on the website? What I know we do have, Mr. Bowman, if you're interested in the individual results, is you can drill down to that through our website, so you can see the outcomes for any particular body participating in the exercise. So you can drill down. But in terms of the list of participants, Anne, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, there is a list of participants on the website. I think it's called something along the lines of 2018-19 NFI participants. But basically, it's all the councils, all the health boards apart from the mental health one, all the colleges, and with respect to the central government bodies, there's actually a detailed list because Scottish Government submit the data on behalf of some of the central government bodies, whereas others submit their own data. So they're actually all listed, and they're split into those that central submit their own data and those that Scottish Government submit on their behalf.
Mr. Bowman? We seem to have lost Mr. Bowman, so I'm now going to go to Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Fiona, I wonder if I could ask a couple of questions in relation to the scope of this particular exercise. When you look at the report, it looks at areas like those claiming council tax and discounts that apply or not, pensions, housing benefit, blue badge holders, student awards, things like that. It seems to be targeting some of the more poorer members of our society. Who decides the scope of this whole NFI initiative, and why doesn't it reach out to other areas, for example, public procurement or corporate contract awards, things like that? So who decides the scope, and why doesn't it lift its gaze to a wider audience, let's say?
So the scope is largely focused on areas where matching different sets of data can actually help in driving out anomalies in the system that may be indicative of fraud or error in the system. So not all areas of public sector spend lend themselves quite so easily to that kind of data comparison. Anne will be able to give you a little bit more detail about the discussions that take place in the Cabinet Office and the discussions we have with them about what would be useful data sets to include. I think it's worth stressing that the data sets included in the exercise are under review all the time. So maybe dropping off some of those that are maybe less useful and less productive, and keeping an eye into new sets of data that could be useful in investigating. And I think we earlier mentioned too, some of the COVID-19 related business grants are probably going to be included in the next exercise. Anne, can you tell us a little bit about what the decision-making process for the data sets?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. As Fiona says, the data is under review by the Cabinet Office, who hold all the data and actually indeed do the data matching on our behalf. I would like to say though, our participants in Scotland are very vocal, and we have quite a few engagement sessions with them across the 2-year period. And at each opportunity, each engagement sessions, we give the fraud specialists, so these are the fraud investigators from the council, from the NHS, from the central government, from colleges. We ask them, what do you think is not included that you be merit in including in future? And we constantly have that dialogue, and they do come to us with some suggestions, but before we would include anything, we would undertake some pilot, and there's piloting work going on sort of all the time with the Cabinet Office. In the past, we've done some piloting round about students' awards, and obviously the non-domestic rates one this time was a pilot exercise. There's other pilots underway, as I think I mentioned. Currently there's stuff on the COVID business grants, which is just about complete. So that would be how we would take any suggestions forward. We are also in the next exercise probably going to look at some other pilots, but again they are risk scored in order to see which ones we think would produce the most sort of valuable outcomes. So it's really in consultation with the actual people at the coalface, rather than someone sitting in the Cabinet Office or indeed in Audit Scotland just trying to think what they would include.
Yeah, so it's essentially the Cabinet Office that determines the scope of this, and it's all about claimants, people who claim things from the system. But surely to goodness, the opportunity for fraud and to perpetrate fraud exists in a much wider scope than that, and particularly in things like areas of public procurement. So if we don't have a system that throws up data anomalies in that activity, it's kind of maybe time they thought about doing that, I think, because I don't think we can totally rely on data anomalies to reveal fraud. And that was leading me to my next question: how else does the system try to determine potential frauds that might occur? We can't surely just rely on data spikes popping up now and again. There has to be internal audit, and I'm sure there is, but there must be other means of potentially identifying fraudulent activity, and surely that then would lead you to allow us to extend the scope of our gaze into other areas that I've mentioned.
I'm really happy that you asked that, Mr. Coffey, because NFI is only one aspect of the work that Audit Scotland does and auditors do on fraud prevention and anti-fraud activity. And I'm going to pass you over to Angela, who will be able to talk you through a range of other activities that Audit Scotland do, and some of that is directly related to procurement. So, Angela, do you want to tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, sure, happy to do that. You've obviously heard this morning about a lot of the work we do around the National Fraud Initiative and what the local auditors will do as part of their engagement with directors of finance and finance teams in the bodies that they audit. We've also been doing more in recent years to raise awareness of fraud across the public sector. So, for example, we've set up a counter fraud hub on our website, and that's really there to share information about fraud risks and signpost people to other organisations like NHS Counter Fraud Services, who will be able to, who are involved in more counter fraud activity. In terms of procurement, last year we published a short output which we developed with Police Scotland, and that was aimed at auditors, and it was about kind of signalling some of the red flags that might come up around procurement. So that's been something that auditors have been taking account of, and the work that they would do locally around procurement. And also mentioned a lot of the engagement that we take across the public sector with individual public bodies, with the fraud investigators as well, but also in talking to organisations like Police Scotland, NHS Counter Fraud, the Chief Internal Auditors Group in local government. Fiona's also mentioned the output which was aimed at audit and risk committees, and also we've obviously spoken this morning as well about the particular output on emerging fraud risks from COVID-19. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the kind of wider work that we've been doing recently around counter fraud.
We get a sense of the year that, let's say, the NFI initiative is purely focused in the scope that it's focused in, and that's what we're reporting on today. How do we get a little sense and a flavour of good work in this area and the value of that good work in this area, so we can get a better total, perhaps, of the bigger picture across Scotland? How can we do that, do you think?
A good first step for committee members that are interested is to have a look at our fraud hub on the Audit Scotland website. But if members are very interested, we'd be happy to provide a briefing in the future on the full range of our fraud activity.
That's really good. Last question from me, convener, if I can. A number of years ago, Fiona, at the committee, I asked the question about whether, when we discover fraudulent activity in a certain year, do we look at those perpetrators in subsequent years? And the answer was no. It was all down to the data matching exercise and whether it threw up these anomalies or not. So can I ask the same question again? If you looked, say, last year and the year before and you got repeat fraudulent activity, why don't we kind of look at it again deliberately in subsequent years? And should we do that?
So we remembered that you asked that question last time round, Mr. Coffey. So Anne's did a little bit of research on it. So I'll hand you over to Anne.
Okay.
Thanks, Fiona. When we get the matches out at the end of the current and the one that's just finished, what we'll ask the Cabinet Office to do, if someone has been found to be committing fraud, say for example in housing benefit, just for something or anything else, if that same match comes up the next time, it's highlighted and it highlights the sort of what's happened the last time. So the council, or even if they've not been found guilty of, even if it wasn't proven the last time, but if the same match, it would be highlighted, it's actually yellow on the screen, to alert the council that this match came up the last time, and last time you either said, oh, it's okay, it's fine, or it's not okay, and you sorted it. The same person has been doing the same thing again. So it is highlighting.
You're breaking up a wee bit.
Breaking up there in council. I'll go back to Willie Coffey.
You were just breaking up a wee bit there, Anne, but I did get the gist of it. Just to finally say, is there no random spot checking that can go on in a process like that? Or has it got to be the computers that throw up the spikes and the data anomalies? Do we not randomly spot check and just have a look across the landscape? Just so that folk know that we're looking and we're not just relying on data spikes alerting us.
So there are obviously rules on data protection about how data, an individual's data, can be used that we need to be alert to. But increasingly, there's been more of a focus on checks happening before services are awarded or before financial support is given. One of those methods we refer to in the report, which is the app check system. So there is a kind of move towards more checks up front to prevent fraud and error down the line, and the NFI is then the exercise down the line that matches various bits of data. In terms of the matches it throws out, they won't all necessarily be investigated. They're classified into high, medium and low risk. So we expect all high risk and medium risk matches to be investigated, but low risk, they might be done on a spot checked basis, as you suggest.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that, Fiona. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I believe Bill Bowman is back on and has one further supplementary question.
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, I missed the responses. I think my question was along the lines of, if you say who has participated, then you can work out who hasn't, and would a potential fraudster then perhaps focus on those that are not participating in this fraud check?
They might, Mr. Bowman, but then they wouldn't know what other controls that organisation had in place to prevent fraud and error. It's always a tricky one, because sometimes it could be said by publicising the kind of frauds that do and can happen, you're actually giving fraudsters, ideas. However, I think our general view is that fraudsters out there are pretty smart and generally don't need any help from auditors on how to go about their business. So I think that's probably low risk.
Perhaps the answer is to make sure everybody participates, as perhaps others have implied earlier. Yeah, apologies for dropping out, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. And I have no other requests for questions, so can I thank Fiona Cordiak, Angela Canning and Anne Cairns from Audit Scotland for their evidence this morning, and I now close the public part of this meeting as we move into private session.